Hope you enjoy my conversation here with Ed Fitzgerald and Alexandra Elliott. We are talking about a program that the library is happy to be co-hosting with the Quincy Historical Society, which both Ed and Alexandra are representing. The program is happening on Monday, August 24th at 7 o'clock, and is called Yellow Fever, the Plague That Haunted America from John Adams to Bette Davis. Ed, Alexandra, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to do another program together.
We're glad to be doing one with you.
Absolutely.
We had such a great turnout when we talked about the 1918 pandemic. And I know it got us, we were in conversations and you had already been thinking about some other pandemics that America has lived through. And the yellow fever, does it qualify as a pandemic? I know we're talking about it as a plague. It was a really, really serious event that was an infectious disease that hurt a lot of people.
It's more a series of epidemics and also some endemic situations where it just existed in some cities year in and year out, like some of the diseases that we experience every summer still do.
Yeah, during a period in the late 1700s, you actually have 7 years in a row when it just keeps coming back and recurring every single year.
Yeah.
Wow. And it was mosquito-borne? Do we know how it was? It was mosquito-borne.
Yeah. Which took them a long time to figure out. I mean, go ahead.
So we do know that it is a mosquito-borne illness. It is still in existence, mostly, though, centralized around tropical climates. But it's essentially a mosquito would bite someone who had the disease and then pass it on to somebody else, and then it would essentially spread from there.
And what are the symptoms for yellow fever? It's not something I have any personal, I don't know what it's like. Thankfully, knock on wood.
Yeah, fortunately, neither do I. But typical symptoms are upset stomach, and where it gets its name from is it causes jaundice, especially in very severe cases. And so the symptoms last for and you have a fever, of course, and a few other miscellaneous symptoms, but typically the qualifying symptom is that jaundice, and that usually lasts for about 5 or 6 days and usually goes away. But in really severe cases after that, it will come back, and that's when it becomes very dangerous. And that's typically where, if it comes back after those 5 days, that's typically a very bad sign.
Yeah. And it was the fatality rate was quite serious.
It is. If it comes back, it's about from what I read on the CDC website, the WHO website, it's about a 50% mortality rate if it comes back, if it's untreated.
Yeah.
Right.
Fortunately, we do have treatments now. It is a viral disease, so like antibiotics and that sort of thing don't work, but we do have vaccines for it today, which Ed will get into a little bit more. We do have some other treatments for it that are quite effective.
But those are all relatively recent, I assume, for a long time.
Right. No, it was, historically, it was a terror because they did not have any effective treatment for it of any kind. They didn't know where it was coming from. And you could, when it got to epidemic conditions, you could survive, but you had very high mortality rates in the cities that it would strike when it was really bad, which it was recurrently from really the beginning of the 18th century straight through to the last epidemic in America was 1905 in New Orleans. So not totally.
So from the 1700s until that's over 200 years.
200 years, yeah.
That's generations and generations of people. That's rather astounding.
Yeah.
Which is why we're billing this program as the plague of, the American plague from John Adams to Bette Davis. Now, most people here in Quincy should be familiar with John Adams. Folks may not be as familiar with Bette Davis. They should be. Why don't you tell us a little bit?
People my age are familiar with Bette Davis. For the benefit of you younger folks, Bette Davis was the great screen actress of really the first half to 2/3 of the 20th century. A lot of people probably remember her from her later things where she was playing in a lot of kind of horror movies and mad killer movies and things like that. But she was a great star of the 30s and 40s, and also really a quite beautiful woman, and arguably probably the best screen actress in history at her peak. So we'll explain how she and John Adams wind up together in Yellow Fever.
It's the same story.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing about it is not only that it lasted, but it got, and I think that's the other thing we're going to try and look at in the program, is it got into people's subconscious. I mean, it haunted people. So we're going to be looking not only at the history of it, but we're going to be looking at some of the sort of cultural and artistic ways that yellow fever has been informing the American discourse, the American art.
It was pretty widespread. I mean, it came up as far north as, how far north did it come? Because being a mosquito-borne illness, climate change, the world was not as hot, through 1905 as it is today. I can imagine if we didn't have treatment for this today, it could be even scarier as we're closing down communities for Triple E last summer and, seeing it's a real threat. But it did affect a lot of America, especially the southern part of the country.
So in answer to how far north it got, where it's a little bit ironic to think that actually one of the first, or I think the first that we know of, outbreak of yellow fever in North America was actually in 1693 in Boston. So
big muddy, huh?
Yeah. It's a funny disease in that it originates and typically propagates in tropical climates, but it just has enough staying power, and it is just a long enough incubation period, and it's contagious enough through the mosquito bites that it can spread. If somebody travels from the Caribbean, for example, and goes somewhere else, they are going to take it with them, potentially. In fact, that is one of the most famous pandemics in American history, is the one in 1793 in Philadelphia, which is part of the John Adams portion of this story. It actually came from people who were fleeing from an outbreak in the Caribbean, went to Philadelphia to get away from it, and ended up bringing it with them.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Yeah.
And were they bringing it, is the thought that they either brought it with them, like in their blood, basically, and mosquitoes then are already present, or? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah,
so
that is.
I think so, yeah.
Standing water with mosquito larvae. Yeah.
Well, it could be either, honestly, because that was one of the main things, and one of the ways in which people started to combat yellow fever at that period was by essentially, all of those advisories against, tipping standing water and everything that we have today. This is exactly where that comes from, or part of where that comes from, is because they realize that obviously it's standing water where these mosquitoes are hatching their eggs. And so to cut down on that population, having above ground water cisterns, that was a huge breeding ground for them. And so that was part of the ways to cut down. But yeah, it was primarily the way that it got from the Caribbean to, and other tropical climates to more temperate climates, was in people who were already infected and who boarded ships without realizing that they were sick.
Yeah.
And potentially the mosquitoes are either on the ships, but obviously less so, but usually as soon as they step off onto the dock, then they start getting bitten by mosquitoes, and then it spreads to the population, typically.
Wow. I'm just so fascinated. This sounds like, the history of America, and then it seems so wrapped up with the history of the yellow fever.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's fascinating that they decided to build Washington, D.C., and I forget the exact timing when it was, I forget his name right now, when D.C. was set up. But I mean, it was put over a swamp. There had to be a lot of mosquitoes in D.C. at the time.
Still are.
And there still are if it's not being sprayed. Was yellow fever wrapped up in the history of that? Did you discover any of that? I don't know.
I haven't seen too much about it in Washington, although it's almost impossible to think that it wasn't. I mean, certainly the yellow fever in Philadelphia, when it was the capital of that series of years that Alexander was referencing, which were also the years of John Adams' vice presidency and presidency in Philadelphia, which is one of the connections, obviously. But New Orleans also, I mean, New Orleans, which was vital to American expansion, and it was really why Louisiana Purchase took place, was because we wanted to secure New Orleans, and we're just trying to go over and make a deal to buy New Orleans, and wound up getting the entire Louisiana territory. And it was endemic in New Orleans, which we're going to talk about in a number of places in the talk. The 1853 epidemic there, 8,000 people died in the summer in a city that, at the time was probably, if it was 100,000 people, was
wow. And
so,
I know that you were saying before, when we were speaking earlier, that that similar to the impact of COVID, that the yellow fever did not, I mean, it could, obviously mosquitoes can bite anyone and infect anyone, but there seems to be a disparate impact on poorer communities, there are people that were greater exposed and at greater risk. And that's something you saw in your research too, which I suspect, I mean, that's something when we look at the history of New Orleans, especially, you look at the Ninth Ward, we look at these areas that have been hit time and time again.
Right.
That was the case, with yellow fever?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, they believe that the ultimate origin of the fever, they believe, is in Africa, and that it was a primate to human transmission at some point. But that also indicates that it got to the New World or to the Western Hemisphere because of slavery. So it becomes literally a curse, but it also becomes kind of almost symbolically a manifestation of the initial curse of slavery. And it could affect immigrant populations. It could affect, obviously, the poor populations, but it was, because it was a mosquito, it was a pretty equal opportunity
infection.
Yeah.
But I assume, I mean, the less resources you have, I mean, I don't know when screens were introduced, but I imagine that, it was easier to get shelter and to have fans or to have things moving the bugs away, the more resources you had. Yeah. If you're living on the swamp without fans or anything, you're just going to get chewed more. That's
exactly. Yeah. Right.
Well, this is fascinating. So people can expect you're going to have a bunch of you're going to have a PowerPoint presentation or something, again, with some graphics and such to show with folks. And I don't know if you want to tell people now, or we can just tell people that there's going to be a multimedia component. There's going to be some movie included in this as well.
I'll say something that maybe Alexander can fill in a bit more from that. But we're kind of watching the history of the actual disease, and we haven't even touched on one of the sequences in the history of the disease in America, which is the final discovery that it is mosquito-borne, and therefore the beginning to control it, which is tied up with the Spanish-American War and Dr. Walter Reed. So we're going to look at that progression, but we're going to sort of try to parallel it the way in which it turned up in American literary and dramatic and other kinds of representation. So that begins right in the Adams presidency with a novel called Arthur Mervyn, which takes place in the 1793 epidemic that Alexander was referring to. We're going to look at a New Orleans novel called The Grand Decime that was done in 1880 in the wake of a very bad 1878 epidemic that looks at the period right around the Louisiana Purchase and really makes the connection to slavery. But then it also got to Hollywood. At least into the 1930s, there were movies about what Yellow Jack, the actual conquest of the disease by the American Army Medical Corps, when the discovery of the mosquito connection, and also a classic 1938 movie called Jezebel, starring Bette Davis, which takes place again in New Orleans, this time in relation to the 1853 epidemic, which is in many ways, kind of your typical Southern hearts aflutter melodrama on one level, but also really, really interesting, and really, really interesting on the time it's looking at and the time it was made as well. So we're gonna get you some multimedia going here. Anyway.
All right. Well, it sounds like a packed evening, and a lot of history, but tied in with culture, intrigue, mystery. There's a lot to cover here, and sordid American past.
The only thing about Jezebel that I would potentially add is that the way that you've described it to me, which I personally find the most compelling, is that it's sort of that blend of Southern melodrama, but also it has this sort of pervasive air of Southern Gothic to it as well. There's a lot of there is. It's a romance, but it's also got some suspense in there, and so it's a really interesting blend of a movie. It'll be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, and the Gothic does. I mean, one of the things that maybe we may not have hit on it quite as much is that if you did get the disease bad, the physical effects on you were really quite horrifying. So it does kind of verge over into a lot of the representations into a kind of horror Gothic effect. So there's a lot to be done.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. So,
yeah.
Great. Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it. Thank you so much for shedding some light, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of lessons that we can learn from this history that we as we think forward to how we're going to live through where we are today. So this should be engaging in so many different levels and provocative for how can we change things so that we can deal with the next pandemic or survive the current one we're in. So thank you so much for talking with me today. I look forward to having this program together.
Thanks for hosting this.
So I hope you've enjoyed my conversation with Ed Fitzgerald and Alexandra Elliott. We have been talking about the program happening on Monday, August 24th at 7:00 p.m. It'll be happening on Zoom, on YouTube, and on Facebook. It is co-presented with the Quincy Historical Society, and it's called Yellow Fever, the Plague That Haunted America, from John Adams to Betty Davis. I hope you will join us for the program.